particular videos, everybody, with introduction to hypothesis testing. And in this particular video, our objective is to define a hypothesis and to write them as well. In particular, null, the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. So let's get it on. Um, we need to first define, though, what a statistical hypothesis is. So, hypothesis testing as a procedure is a decision-making process for evaluating the claims about a population. So that's what hypothesis testing is. So we are given a hypothesis, or we will be the ones writing it, and we're gonna test if it's true or not using statistical methods. In some other definitions, it is an assertion or conjecture, or a guess, an educated guess, shall we say, concerning one or more population, or it is a conjecture or a guesswork about a population parameter. This may or may not be true. So that's why we need to test it to determine its trueness. So we have two types of hypotheses, the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis, also known as H sub O or H sub 0 in some books, is a statement of zero difference. This assumes that there's no difference or relationship between the variables or the means of those variables being compared, or no relationship between or association between two variables. That's why the symbol used for the null hypothesis is always the equal sign. And note that this is the hypothesis that we want to reject. All right. The alternative hypothesis, or the HA or H sub 1, is a statement that assumes that there is a significant difference or relationship between two variables under investigation. We use the symbols, the inequalities, to represent alternative hypothesis. This is the hypothesis that we accept when the null hypothesis is rejected. So these are, in summary, the null hypothesis is always the no difference. These are some standard statements that is used to show the null hypothesis. And likewise, these are um, the examples here are statements which we usually use to denote an alternative hypothesis. Remember, the alternative hypothesis is a hypothesis that is questioned by the researcher or being explored by the researcher. So notice that in the null hypothesis, we always see the equal word, or the equal sign if it's gonna be in symbolic form, and in the alternative hypothesis, it's always the inequalities. So that's one thing that you can actually just see it in one instance, in a glimpse. You can see, you can determine if it's a null hypothesis or an alternative hypothesis. So we'll highlight some procedures or some things noting between these two. So they're not actually treated on equal basis. We always give this special consideration to to the null hypothesis, because it is the hypothesis that we are actually testing, and it should be either rejected or not rejected. All right. The alternative hypothesis will be the choice only if the null hypothesis will be rejected. So, I always tell my students, why are we doing this? You can actually, you might be curious when writing the hypothesis of a study of your research, that we always use the null hypothesis. Well, why is that? Because in research, we don't want to assume that there is a difference or there is a relationship firsthand. What we want to do is we assume the status quo. There's no difference, there's no relationship, and we would want to reject that assumption of status quo, so that the alternative will be the ones that is actually happening. So that's why we don't assume that there is something happening or there's a difference already. We assume that there's none, and we want to reject that assumption. All right. So that's the main reason why we write the null hypothesis in the hypothesis of the study in a research paper. So, like I said, the null hypothesis is the status quo. And when doing a hypothesis test, our objective is to determine there is enough evidence to do so. Take note on a very important thing, or an important note. some would argue with this with me, but I'm following the book of Walpole. And the conclusion of the hypothesis, he said, is always whether the null hypothesis should be rejected or not. Rejecting the null hypothesis means that the conclusion is in favor of the alternative. This is simply because of sufficient data or enough data to start with. Experts never accept here or even use the word accept the null hypothesis. They use the terms do not reject or fail to reject because this means that it's because of insufficient evidence to say so. Now, there will be arguments regarding this because some books are using accept the null hypothesis. We would say otherwise, because we don't accept the null, we only reject or not reject it. A beautiful analogy for this, according to Walpole, is the courtroom analogy of Walpole. This is taken from his wonderful book, um, Probability and Statistics for Engineers and Scientists. I, if I'm not mistaken, this is together with Myers, Yee. I think there are two Myers there, and Walpole himself. um the statements of Walpole regarding this analogy is, the null hypothesis is that the defendant is innocent, and the alternative is the defendant is guilty, or of course not innocent. The hypothesis, uh, H sub O, or the null hypothesis, which stands for the status quo in this case, stands in opposition of the alternative, which is being guilty, and this is maintained unless the alternative is supported by evidence beyond reasonable doubt. This maintenance of innocence is what we call in the law presumption of innocence, right? It's only going to be um, maintained unless there is enough evidence, which is in law we have terms beyond reasonable doubt that would say that there is enough evidence to say that he or she is guilty. However, if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, failing to reject the the innocence of that individual, it does not actually imply real innocence, because to start with, in the first place, he or she is already in the courtroom, right? So he or she really did something. Um, to start with, but merely that the evidence was insufficient to convict. So there's insufficient evidence, not enough to say that he or she is guilty. So the jury or the judges does not necessarily accept innocence, but only fails to reject such. So hopefully you understand that. If you need more, um, uh, it's a story. I really like this analogy of Walpole. If you want to hear it again, you can always, drag the screen there. What they call that, the the thing on the video. You can always just repeat that part. I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna test the hypothesis. Remember again and again, the null hypothesis is no difference alternative. It's the one being explored by the researcher. So statistical methods are used to test the hypothesis. Okay, and remember that the null hypothesis is the basis for statistical tests. Let us cite three examples in this case before we end the video. Three to four, shall we say. Let us consider this to assess the effect of the lactation nurse on attitude towards breastfeeding among women. So the research question is, in this case, does the lactation nurse have an effect on attitude towards breastfeeding? So if we're going to write the null hypothesis, it would look like this. The lactation nurse has no effect on attitude towards breastfeeding. So you can see that it is the status quo. There's no effect, no on attitude towards breastfeeding. And the alternative will be it has an effect. So always remember, no effect equal status quo is the null, and the alternative is the one being explored. Another example. A researcher thinks that if expectant mothers use vitamin pills, the birth weight of the babies will increase. The average birth weight of the population is 6.2 pounds. So, we need to, think of first to lessen the burden of writing the hypothesis. We need to first acknowledge the variable. So the variable here, what do you think is the variable here? Okay, so the variable here is the average birth weight of babies. To be exact, it is in pounds, and it is a population mean. So that's the parameter that we want to test. If you have this the solutions here, the variable in the parameter being tested, you can actually go ahead and write the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is that the parameter being tested, this your mean, which is the average birth weight of babies, is equal to 6.2. We call this, everybody, the symbolic form of writing the null hypothesis, and this is the worded format. Either is true or correct, or it could be, it depends on your teacher if they will require two. But in reality, in research, we only need the worded format. And the alternative is what the researcher wants is if the birth weight will increase. So it's going to be greater than, we're going to make use of the greater than symbol. And in worded format, the average birth weight of babies is more than 6.2 pounds. So you can always repeat this part if you need more clarification. Number two, I think we can end in here. An engineer hypothesizes that the mean number of defects can be decreased in the manufacturing process of CDs using robots instead of humans for certain tasks. So the mean number of defective CDs is known to be 18 per 1,000. So we need to first understand the variable. The variable is the mean number of defective CDs. It's a population mean, and for the null, it's always going to be a status quo. It's as is, it's 18. And our alternative is, what does the engineer want here? The engineer wanted to check if the number will decrease. So from that term, we're going to make use of the less than symbol. Mu is less than 18. This is testing if the robots are more efficient in creating CDs than humans. I think I need to really present this last one. Number three. A psychologist feels that playing soft music during a test will change the results of the test. She is not sure, though, whether the grades will be higher or lower. In the past, the mean of the scores was 73. So there was no specific direction where the alternative hypothesis would want to explore. It just tells that, it may be higher or lower. So let's first establish the variable. The variable that we want to measure here are the grades or the mean scores. It's a population mean, no doubt. And the null hypothesis will be the mean score is equal to 73. That's going to be clear. But the alternative one is actually giving you two things to consider. It's going to be higher or lower. You cannot use both the inequality symbols like greater than and less than at the same time. The workaround there is we're going to make use of the non-equal sign. That symbol right here. And in the worded format, the mean score is not equal to 73, and that's the answer for your H sub 1 or H sub 8. And that ends the video for today. If you need to clarify some points, you can always repeat the video, go to the part where you don't understand that much, and repeat it until you will understand that part. And do the practice or the exercise yourself. Okay, you will see an improvement if you do such. So thank you very much, and I'll be seeing you in the next video. Thank you.